The story of Berlin in the 1920s tells of one of the most contradictory, passionate, and tragic periods in human history. This city was, at the same time, both the dazzling showcase of the modern world and the dark harbinger of approaching catastrophes. Nights that ended in cabarets, mornings followed by millions of unemployed people desperately searching for work, evenings marked by political militias clashing on street corners. Weimar Berlin was a city living through all these contrasts at once, struggling to absorb them. With the end of the First World War in 1918, Germany did not experience merely a military defeat. A centuries-old monarchical order collapsed, the social contract was shattered, and millions of people poured into the streets, having lost their sense of the future. In the very heart of this chaos, Berlin began to build a new identity. This identity was neither fully communist nor fully capitalist, neither entirely traditional nor completely modern. Weimar Berlin was an experimental laboratory where everything seemed possible at the same time, where every kind of experience was lived and every kind of idea could be expressed. You would walk along the broad boulevards of Unter den Linden, gaze at the glamorous shops of Kurfürstendamm, watch drag performers on the stage of the El Dorado, stand before the portraits created by Otto Dix's merciless brush, and witness Marlene Dietrich's first steps in cinema. But at the same time, you would also see the desperation of women in 1923, carrying sacks of money to buy a single loaf of bread, the hopelessness of families who lost their jobs in 1929, and the brutality of street battles between fascist and communist militias. This is not a story of romanticized nostalgia. It is the story of real people, their real suffering, their real hopes, their real freedoms, and their real fears. The fall of the Kaiser and the collapse of the empire. November 1918 was one of the major turning points in Berlin's history. 4 years of war had exhausted Germany in every sense. The fighting on the Western Front had buried hundreds of thousands of young men in the ground. There was no food left in homes, raw materials had run out in factories, and people were starving. Britain's naval blockade was strangling Germany. Bread was distributed by ration cards, and ordinary people tried to survive on pickle brine. In the first days of November, sailors in the port of Kiel mutinied. The admirals, in a desperate final move, were planning what amounted to a suicide mission against the British Navy. The sailors refused. Red flags began to fly on the ships. The revolt spread across Germany like a forest fire. In Hamburg, Munich, and Leipzig, workers' and soldiers' councils were formed. Modeled on the Soviets in Russia, these councils claimed the right to seize power. Saturday, November 9, 1918. The weather in Berlin was cold and cloudy. Kaiser Wilhelm II, at his headquarters in Spa, was forced to make a decision. He would abdicate. In fact, before he formally did so, Chancellor Max von Baden announced the abdication in the Kaiser's name. Technically, this could be considered a coup, but by then, no one really cared. The Hohenzollern dynasty, which had ruled Germany for centuries, was being consigned to the dustbin of history. That same afternoon, 2 different republics were proclaimed in the center of Berlin. Social Democratic Party leader Philipp Scheidemann addressed the public from a window of the Reichstag and declared the republic. A few hours later, Spartacist leader Karl Liebknecht proclaimed a free socialist republic from the balcony of the Berlin Palace. The difference between these 2 declarations was not merely semantic. They represented 2 competing visions, 2 different paths for Germany's future. The Social Democratic Party wanted parliamentary democracy and gradual reforms. The Spartacists, and later the Communist Party, dreamed of a Soviet republic ruled by workers' councils. Bloody January, the Spartacist uprising. The armistice had been signed, and the war was officially over. But in Berlin, the real conflict was just beginning. By the end of 1918, the city had effectively turned into a battlefield. The provisional government, led by Friedrich Ebert, relied on right-wing paramilitary groups known as the Freikorps to maintain order. This decision would sow the seeds of disaster. The Freikorps consisted largely of soldiers who had just returned from the war, men accustomed to violence and unable to reintegrate into civilian life. Many were fiercely nationalist and deeply anti-communist. Former officers of the Kaiser's army, they viewed the new republic as weak and as a regime that had surrendered to traitors. Yet the Social Democratic government believed it had no alternative if it wanted to restore order. The regular army had disintegrated and the police were inadequate. Against left-wing radicals, the government placed its trust in right-wing radicals. This was one of the Weimar Republic's most tragic contradictions. In December 1918, fighting broke out in Berlin between the government and the People's Naval Division. The sailors had occupied the Berlin Palace and were making demands more radical than those of the moderate socialists. The government sent Freikorps units against them. Many people were killed in the clashes. This event deepened the rift between the radical left and the Social Democratic Party. By January 1919, the situation had reached a breaking point. The Spartacus League, led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, launched a general uprising in Berlin. On January 5th, thousands of workers poured into the streets. Newspaper printing offices were occupied and strategic buildings were seized. Slogans rang out, "All power to the workers' councils." Rosa Luxemburg herself was not convinced about the timing of the uprising. As an experienced revolutionary, she knew that an unprepared revolt was doomed to fail. But the radicals, especially younger militants, were impatient. The Bolsheviks had succeeded in Russia. Why shouldn't it work in Berlin? The answer came swiftly, brutally, and in blood. The Ebert government granted full authority to Defense Minister Gustav Noske. Noske uttered his infamous words, "Someone has to be the bloodhound." Freikorps units crushed the uprising in a systematic and merciless fashion. By January 15th, the revolt had been crushed. Hundreds of insurgents were dead, but the tragedy was not yet over. On the evening of January 15th, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were captured. They were taken to a hotel in western Berlin by Freikorps members of the Guard Cavalry Rifle Division. They were interrogated there. Then, under the pretext that they were trying to escape during a transfer, they were murdered. Karl Liebknecht was shot in the head in the Tiergarten. Rosa Luxemburg was beaten with a rifle butt, her skull smashed, and her body thrown into the Landwehr Canal. Her body would only be found months later. These murders opened wounds in the German left that would never truly heal. In the eyes of the radical left, the Social Democratic Party became an accomplice to murder. Communists never trusted the Social Democrats again. This division would later be one of the factors that made Hitler's rise to power in 1933 easier. Hostility toward the Social Democrats, branded social fascists, ran so deep within the Communist Party that they were sometimes seen as more dangerous than the real fascists. The Weimar Constitution, a perfect democracy on paper. After the chaos of January 1919, elections for a constituent assembly were held on January 19th to found the new German Republic. These were the most democratic elections Germany had ever seen. All men over the age of 20, and, for the first time, all women, had the right to vote. Voter turnout was 83%. Overnight, Germany possessed one of the most progressive democratic systems in Europe. Because of the ongoing violence in Berlin, the assembly met not in the capital, but in Weimar. The choice was symbolic. This small Thuringian city was associated with Goethe and Schiller, the heart of German classical culture. The message was clear. The new Germany would inherit the legacy of German humanism, not Prussian militarism. On February 11th, Friedrich Ebert was elected the Republic's first president. A commission led by Hugo Preuss drafted the new constitution. Adopted on July 31, 1919, the Weimar Constitution was, on paper, an almost perfect democratic document. It introduced proportional representation, granted women the right to vote and to stand for office, guaranteed extensive civil rights, and envisioned a strong social state. Yet the Constitution had serious flaws. The most significant was Article 48, the so-called Emergency Clause. It granted the president the power to rule by decree in extraordinary circumstances, bypassing Parliament and the courts. In the 1930s, this article would be used to dig democracy's grave with its own hands. Another problem was instability. The system allowed governments to be formed and brought down easily through votes of confidence and no confidence. Between 1919 and 1933, over a period of just 14 years, 20 different cabinets were formed. Constant government crises eroded public trust in democracy. In addition, the president was elected directly by the people. While this gave the office strong democratic legitimacy, it also turned the president into an independent power center, separate from the chancellor and parliament. This problem became even more pronounced with the election of Hindenburg as president in 1925. The shadow of Versailles, the dictate, and the stab-in-the-back myth. What truly weakened the Weimar Republic, however, was not so much its constitutional flaws as the Treaty of Versailles. Signed in Paris on June 28, 1919, the treaty imposed a harsh punishment on Germany. Germany lost 13% of its territory. Alsace-Lorraine went to France, Posen and West Prussia to Poland. Danzig was declared a free city. The Saarland was placed under French administration for 15 years. All of Germany's colonies were confiscated. The German army was limited to 100,000 men. Air forces, submarines, and heavy weapons were banned. The Rhineland was demilitarized and occupied by Allied forces. But the most painful provision was Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause. It placed sole responsibility for the war on Germany. This was not only a legal judgment, but a moral condemnation. And as a consequence of this guilt, Germany was required to pay massive war reparations. Initially, no specific sum was named, but in 1921, it was set at 132 billion gold marks, about $33 billion at the time, roughly $450 billion in today's value. For the German public, Versailles was a diktat, an imposed humiliation. Germany had been excluded from negotiations. It was told, accept the treaty or face occupation. The Weimar government had no choice but to sign. That signature would stain the republic from the moment of its birth. Right-wing nationalists spread the stab-in-the-back myth. According to this narrative, the German army had not been defeated on the battlefield. Instead, socialists, Jews, and the so-called November criminals had betrayed the nation and forced peace. This was pure propaganda. By 1918, the German army had collapsed, the Allies were advancing, and military victory was impossible. Yet this myth continually undermined the Weimar Republic. Those who founded the Republic were branded November criminals, and those who signed the treaty were labeled Versailles criminals. In this atmosphere, the Weimar Republic never achieved full legitimacy. Communists on the left saw it as a bourgeois deception. Nationalists on the right condemned it as a treasonous regime that had betrayed the nation. The Democrats in the middle were crushed between these two fires.